Everybody says they'd stop, that if they saw someone hurt on the side of the road, they'd pull over, no matter what. But almost nobody gets asked to prove it at the exact moment it would cost them everything. Eli Carter was 18, broke, and 15 minutes from the only real chance his family had had in years, when the question stopped being hypothetical. What he did next lost him the job before he ever walked through the door. He thought that was the end of the story. He had it exactly backwards, because the worst morning of his life was about to become the reason for everything that came after. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over an empty road just after something terrible has happened on it. Not silence exactly. There was wind moving through the dry grass along the guardrail, and somewhere far off the sound of traffic that belonged to a normal morning going on without them. But under all of that, a stillness. A young man was kneeling in the gravel with both hands pressed hard against a stranger's leg, and the white shirt he had ironed the night before was no longer white. It was soaked through, dark and warm, and he was pressing it down with everything he had while a voice on a cracked phone told him to keep doing exactly that. He was talking too, low and steady, the way you talk to someone you are afraid will drift off if you stop. Somewhere in the back of his mind a clock was running, and he knew what the numbers meant, and he did not look at them. His name was Eli Carter. He was 18 years old, and to understand why he was there, on his knees in the dirt on the most important morning of his life, with someone else's blood drying on his hands, you have to go back. You have to understand what he was driving toward, and just how little room a kid like Eli had ever been given to make a choice like the one he was making. Eli had learned early, the way poor kids do, that being broke is expensive. It costs you in ways nobody puts on a receipt. The transmission you can't afford to fix that ends up costing you 3 jobs. The doctor's visit you skip that turns into the emergency room bill you'll be paying off for 2 years. He'd learned it watching his mother, Colleen, come home from the nursing home where she worked nights, 44 years old, and moving like a woman twice that, peeling off her shoes at the kitchen table because her feet hurt too much to walk to her room. She worked the overnight shift caring for other people's parents, and then she'd sleep a few hours and get up to be a parent herself, and Eli had spent most of his life trying to figure out how to lift some of that weight off her without her noticing he was doing it. Their house was small, and it leaned a little, the way old houses do, and the porch step out front had been cracked and wobbling for the better part of a year. Eli kept meaning to fix it. There was always something more urgent. His sister Mia was 11 and needed rides to school because the bus stop was a mile off down a road with no sidewalk, and Eli was the one who drove her. In a silver Honda, he kept alive through what could only be called stubbornness, duct tape on the side mirror, a coat hanger holding part of the exhaust, an engine that turned over on the third try if you talked to it right. He'd graduated high school the spring before, and since then he'd been doing whatever the day offered. Hauling boxes, delivering groceries, loading trucks at a distribution center when they needed extra hands. None of it steady, none of it with insurance, or hours you could plan a life around. He was the kind of kid who read the mail before his mother got to it, because he'd rather she came home to good news than to a red envelope. He was the kind of kid who noticed things, who saw when a neighbor was struggling with too many grocery bags, and who couldn't quite walk past it. A few weeks before all of this, he'd stopped to help old Mr. Pruitt from down the street carry his groceries up his driveway, and it had made Eli 20 minutes late to a shift, and the man who'd hired him for the day had shrugged and given the work to somebody else. When Eli told his mother about it that night, she hadn't yelled. She just looked at him for a long moment with something tired and tender in her face. "You've got to learn there's a price for being the only one who stops, baby," she said. "The world doesn't always pay you back for it." He nodded like he understood. He didn't, not really. Not yet. Then, for the first time and longer than any of them wanted to count, a door opened. It came as an email, then a phone call confirming it. A full-time position at a big warehouse operation across town. Not seasonal. Not day labor. A real job, with steady hours, and, most importantly, health insurance. To most people that phrase is background noise. To the Carters it was oxygen. It meant Colleen might finally be able to drop one of her 2 jobs. It meant if Mia got sick, there'd be a way to take her to a doctor that didn't involve a spreadsheet and a prayer. Eli read the confirmation 3 times to make sure it was real, and then he sat very still because he'd learned not to hope too loudly. Hope, when you're poor, has a way of hearing you and taking it personally. The night before the interview, he ironed his one dress shirt. He owned exactly one. White, a little big in the shoulders because it had been bought to last. He set up the ironing board in the living room and worked over the collar with a concentration you'd think was reserved for surgery, and Mia sat on the couch with her chin on her knees and appointed herself as interviewer. "So," she said, in a voice she must have thought sounded very professional, "why should we hire you, mister?" "Because I show up," Eli said, not looking up from the collar. "That's it? That's your whole answer?" "That's the whole thing, Mia. 90% of it is just showing up when you said you would." She narrowed her eyes at him. "You're going to get rejected." "Probably," he said, and cracked a grin, and she threw a couch pillow at him, and for a minute the two of them just laughed in a warm little room in a leaning house, and none of them knew it was the last easy laugh they'd have for a while. Colleen came out in her robe before she left for her shift. She stood in the doorway watching him hang the shirt on the closet door where it wouldn't wrinkle, and when he turned around, she took his face in both her hands the way she used to when he was small. "Listen to me," she said. "They've got hundreds of people who want this. Hundreds. So you do not give them a single reason. You be early. You hear me? Whatever happens, do not be late. Because nobody down there is going to care why. I hear you, Ma. Say it back to me. I won't be late." She held his face a second longer, then let go and got her keys and went out into the dark to go take care of strangers all night. Eli went to bed and lay awake a long time, running answers in his head, and out in the living room the white shirt hung on the closet door like a flag. The interview was at 9 o'clock. Eli left at 8, which gave him a cushion of 30 full minutes for a drive that took 20. He was careful like that. He didn't trust the world to go smoothly, so he built in room for it not to. The morning was clear and cold, the sun coming up gold over the low industrial edge of town, and he had the resumed folder squared on the passenger seat, a plain manila folder with his one page inside, and a little list he'd handwritten of things to remember to say. He talked the Honda into starting on the second try. He pulled out onto the road with his whole future sitting neatly beside him in a folder, and for a few miles everything was exactly as it should be. He was maybe 15 minutes out when he saw the motorcycle. It was lying on its side near the mouth of an industrial access road, a stretch that ran back toward the freight yards and warehouses, mostly empty at that hour. His first thought, the natural one, the one that lets all of us keep driving, was that somebody had already handled it. Somebody must have called. There was a bike down, but the world was full of bikes and full of people, and surely. He'd gone another few hundred feet before something made him look again in the mirror. A shape by the guardrail. Moving. Not a piece of debris. A man, dragging himself along the gravel with one arm. Eli looked at the clock. It read 8:31. He did the math without wanting to. 15 minutes to the warehouse, and then he'd still have almost 15 to spare. But if he stopped, he did not know how long it would take, and he could not unknow what he'd seen in the mirror. He sat at that decision for exactly as long as it takes a decent person to lose an argument with himself. Then he pulled over. The man was big, in his late 50s, gray in his beard and gray in the stubble on his cheeks, and there was a wrongness to the way his leg lay that Eli felt in his own stomach. His jeans were dark and wet from the thigh down. His phone was on the ground a few feet away, the screen a spiderweb of cracks. He'd been trying to reach it. When Eli dropped down beside him, the man's eyes came open, unfocused, then found him. "Don't," the man said, and his voice was rough, working hard. "You're dressed for something. Go on. I'm not your problem." "You're bleeding," Eli said. "A lot. Where's it coming from?" "Leg. Truck clipped me. Didn't stop." The man let his head rest back against the guardrail post. "Go. I mean it, kid." Eli wasn't listening anymore, not really. He'd already stripped off the white shirt, the one his mother had made him promise something over, and he was folding it into a thick pad and pressing it down hard over the worst of the wound. The man made a sound low in his chest. Eli kept the pressure on with one hand and got his own phone out with the other and dialed. And when the operator answered, he gave her everything. The road, the access turnoff, a man in his 50s, a motorcycle down, a leg wound, bleeding heavy, hit and run. "Keep the pressure on," she told him. "Don't let up. Keep him talking." Eli said he would. "What's your name?" Eli asked him. "Ray," the man said, after a moment. "Ray Mercer." "Okay, Ray. I'm Eli. You're going to stay with me, all right? Ambulance is coming. You just stay with me. You got somewhere to be." Ray's eyes had drifted half shut, and Eli said his name sharp, and they opened again. "That shirt. That's an interview shirt." A ghost of something crossed his gray face. "You shouldn't have stopped, kid." There was a strange weight in the way he said it. Not just the obvious thing. Not just a man telling a stranger not to wreck his morning on his account. Something underneath it that Eli had no way to read and no time to try. He just pressed harder and kept talking. About nothing. About the weather and the cold and how the ambulance would be there any minute. And Ray answered less and less. And the shirt in Eli's hands went from white to red. And the minutes ran, and Eli did not look at the time. The ambulance came in a rush of light and noise and sudden purpose. Hands took over, better hands than his, and Eli stepped back and stood there in his blood-streaked undershirt. Useless now in the way you're useless when the professionals arrive. And he watched them work Ray onto a board and load him up. One of them asked Eli if he was hurt, glancing at all the red on him, and Eli said no, none of it's mine, and the man nodded and climbed in, and the doors shut, and they were gone. And Eli was standing alone on an empty road with a ruined shirt in his hand and his heart going like a drum. And when he finally looked at his phone, the time on it said 9:04. He got back in the Honda, and he drove. He told himself, all the way there, that he might still make it, that they'd understand, that a person could see the state of him and just know. He pulled into the warehouse lot at 9:22 in a stained undershirt, his hands scrubbed pink at a gas station sink, but not truly clean. Blood dried in the creases of his knuckles. He half ran to the door. Inside was a bright lobby with a front desk and a clipboard and a woman with a headset who looked up at him and then looked at him again, taking in the shirt, the state of him. "I'm here for the 9 o'clock interview," Eli said. "I know I'm late. I know how it looks. There was an accident on the way. A man was hurt. I stopped to help him. I couldn't just." "Sir." She said it kindly enough. That was almost the worst part. "The 9 o'clocks are done. We had a full schedule this morning. Please, if I could just talk to somebody for 5 minutes. I'm sorry. The position's been filled." She wasn't cruel. She wasn't anything. She'd heard 100 reasons in her time at that desk, and she had no way to sort the true ones from the rest, and it wasn't her job to try. "I really am sorry." He stood there a moment longer than he should have. Then he thanked her. He actually thanked her, because his mother had raised him to, and he walked back out to the lot and got in his car, and he did not start it. He sat with both hands on the wheel and looked at nothing, and his mother's voice was in his head, the one from the doorway, the one that had held his face in both hands. Nobody down there is going to care why. She'd been right. That was the thing about his mother. She was almost always right about how the world worked, and being right had never once made it hurt her any less. He drove home slow. When he came through the door, Colleen was up, having caught a few hours of sleep, and she read his face before he got a word out. She'd been reading his face for 18 years, and she was fluent in it. She saw the rusty color still in the lines of his knuckles, too, and she opened her mouth, and then she closed it. Because she knew her son. If he wanted to tell her, he'd tell her. "I didn't get it," was all he said. "Oh, baby." She came and put her arms around him, and he let her, standing stiff for a second, and then not. "There'll be others." "Yeah," he said, into her shoulder. "There'll be others." He never told her about Ray. Not because he was hiding it, exactly. Because to Eli it wasn't a thing you cashed in. It wasn't leverage. It was just what had happened, and it was over, and turning it into a story felt like turning it into an excuse, and he'd rather eat the loss whole than dress it up. He put the ruined shirt in the trash himself, quietly, so his mother wouldn't have to look at it. And then the days went on, the way they do. Eli went back to what he'd been doing. The hauling, the deliveries, the job boards glowing on his phone at 1 in the morning when the house was asleep. He'd scroll them until his eyes burned, applying to things he was overqualified for and things he was underqualified for and everything in between. And in the morning he'd get up and drive Mia and take whatever the day put in front of him. There was a shift stacking pallets at a distribution center, a Saturday helping a man move a garage full of furniture, an evening bagging groceries when somebody called in sick. Small money, spread thin. He learned again the arithmetic he'd known his whole life, the arithmetic of which bill you pay this week and which one you tell to wait, and he did it quietly, at the kitchen table after everyone was asleep, so that his mother would only ever see the parts that were handled. There was a small warmth in those weeks too, because there always is. One night the fridge was nearly empty and Eli made cereal for dinner, 2 bowls of it, and set one down in front of Mia with a spoon and a completely straight face, and Mia looked at it, and then at him, and started laughing. And pretty soon they were both laughing so hard that Mia got the hiccups, And Eli decided right then that cereal for dinner was a tradition now, a thing they did on purpose. And Mia agreed with the solemnity of an 11-year-old accepting an important responsibility. He fixed a neighbor's fence one afternoon for $40 cash and put every bit of it toward the electric bill. He kept the house going. 2 weeks passed. If you'd watched him from the outside, you'd have said he was the same. He got up, he drove Mia, he took whatever work came, he came home. But there was a thing that had gotten into him that hadn't been there before, and it showed up at the strangest moment. He was out on a grocery run, and he passed a car pulled onto the shoulder with its hood up and a man standing beside it looking lost. And Eli's foot came off the gas the way it always did, automatically, the way water runs downhill. And then, for the first time in his life, he hesitated. His hand stayed on the wheel. A voice he didn't recognize as his own said, "You stopped last time, and look what it got you." He caught himself in the middle of the thought, and it turned his stomach. He did pull over, in the end. He helped the man get his car started. But the hesitation had happened, and he couldn't unfeel it, and it scared him more than losing the job had. Because he understood, in a way he couldn't have put into words, that this was how a good person got worn down into a careful one. One reasonable hesitation at a time. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that at that same moment, across town, a man he assumed he'd never hear about again remembered everything. Ray Mercer had come out of surgery with his leg intact, and the surgeon had said the thing that mattered plainly. The bleeding had been controlled fast enough, out there on the road, and that was the difference. That was why there was still a leg to save, and maybe more than the leg. Ray had heard that and gone quiet in a way the people around him weren't used to. Because Ray remembered. He remembered a kid's face close to his own, filthy with worry. He remembered a white shirt going red and a pair of steady young hands. He remembered a beat-up silver Honda pulled crooked on the shoulder, and a voice that wouldn't quit talking to him, and one name. Eli. He didn't have a last name. He didn't have a phone number. He had a first name, a car he'd half seen, and a folder that had been left behind in the gravel when the ambulance loaded him up. A plain manila folder that a paramedic had scooped up with Ray's cracked phone and Ray's wallet and handed over at the hospital, because it had been lying right there beside all of it. On the front of that folder, printed neat, was the name of a warehouse company. Ray's people came to see him. If you'd been in the hospital that week, you'd have noticed them. Leather vests and gray beards, big men who moved carefully around the machines, taking turns in the chair by his bed so he was never alone. They were the Iron Saints, a motorcycle club Ray had ridden with for the better part of 30 years, and they took care of their own with a matter-of-factness that had nothing to do with drama. Somebody mowed Ray's lawn. Somebody fed his dog. Nobody made a speech about it. On the back of every one of their vests, stitched below the main patch, was a smaller one, a rocker with 4 words and 2 initials. No rider left down, ST. When Ray thought no one was watching, his hand would drift to the arm of the chair, to a spot on his own vest folded over the rail, and rest there. His closest brother in the club was a man named Frank Kowalski, though nobody had called him Frank in decades. He was Deacon, 61, lean and dry and steady, and he'd known Ray longer than either of them had known their own wives. It was Deacon who found Ray staring at that manila folder on the 3rd day, turning it over in his big hands. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" Deacon said. It wasn't really a question. "Kid gave up something to stop for me," Ray said. "I want to know what." "You don't even have a last name." "I've got a first name, a company, and a car nobody's washed since the Clinton administration." Ray set the folder down. "Find him, Deacon. I don't care what it takes." Deacon studied his old friend for a moment. There was something in Ray's face that went past ordinary gratitude, something older and heavier, and Deacon had known him too long not to see it. "Why is this one different, Ray?" he asked, quiet. Ray didn't answer. He turned his face to the window and looked at the parking lot full of bikes, and after a while Deacon let it go and went to make some calls. The search started small, the way these things do. Deacon knew a guy. That guy knew a couple of guys. A writer named Tuck took the folder's company name and rode out to the warehouse himself one afternoon, walked into that same bright lobby, and asked the woman at the desk whether they'd had a young man named Eli come through recently. She frowned, thinking, and then something cleared in her face. "There was a kid," she said slowly. "A couple weeks back. Showed up late, missed his interview. Had this. I remember he was a mess. Honestly, he had a whole story about a hurt biker on the road." She stopped. She looked at the vest on Tuck's back, at the 4 words stitched under the patch, and something moved behind her eyes. "Oh," she said softer. "Oh no. Was that true?" "Yes, ma'am," Tuck said. "That was true." The story didn't stay in one place after that. That's the thing about a story like that inside a world like theirs. It found something these men had built their whole lives around, and it started to move on its own. A kid, an outsider, no colors, no club, no dog in the fight. And he'd looked at a bleeding stranger and a chance he desperately needed. And he'd chosen the stranger, and it had cost him, and he'd never said a word about it or asked for a thing in return. Tuck told 2 brothers. Those 2 told their chapter. Somebody rode out to another town and told a chapter there. It didn't spread because it was spectacular. It spread because every man who heard it recognized it. It was the exact thing they promised each other they'd always do, the thing they stitched onto their backs. And here was a teenager with no reason to have done it, who'd done it anyway. Deacon himself, telling it one night in the clubhouse, telling how the kid had used his own interview shirt to stop the bleeding, felt his throat go tight in the middle of the sentence and had to stop and clear it. And he stood there confused at himself, a hard old man getting choked up over a boy he'd never met. They pieced Eli together the way you piece anyone together when a community decides to look. The warehouse didn't have his home address to give out, but somebody knew somebody in the same part of town, and the silver Honda with the coat hanger exhaust was not a hard thing to spot once people were looking for it. And one thread led to another until Deacon had a street and a house number and the name Carter written on a slip of paper in his pocket. But even as it all came together, Deacon still didn't understand the thing he'd asked about at the hospital. He didn't understand why his old friend couldn't sleep. Why Ray, who was healing fine, who should have been relieved and grateful and done with it, seemed instead to be carrying something that got heavier every day. It came out one night, late, at Ray's kitchen table, under a single lamp, the 2 of them alone. Ray had a coffee going cold in front of him and the folded vest on the table between them, and he was looking at that small stitched rocker, at the 2 initials, and finally he started to talk in a voice Deacon had never quite heard him use. "You know what those letters are?" Ray said. It wasn't a question either. "Sam Doyle," Deacon said. "Before my time. The one this whole thing got started for. You know the story we tell? That Sam went down on a cold night, and help didn't come in time, and that's why we swore what we swore. No rider left down." Ray turned the vest over in his hands. "That's the version we tell." Deacon waited. He'd learned, over 40 years, when to wait. "I was there," Ray said. "That's the part nobody knows. I was a kid then, younger than that boy is now, near enough. Broke, and in a hurry to somewhere that felt like the whole world at the time, and I couldn't tell you now where it even was. And I came over a rise on a cold night, and there was a man off the side of the road, stood down, waving. And Ray stopped. His jaw worked. I told myself somebody else stop. It was cold, and I was late, and I told myself somebody with more time, somebody better set up for it. Somebody else would come along and handle it. And I rode on. The lamp hummed. Somewhere in the house the dog shifted and settled. By morning it was Sam, Ray said. By morning I found out it was Sam who'd been standing on that road waving at whoever came over the rise, and nobody came over the rise in time, and I was one of the ones who didn't stop. I never told a soul it was me went past him. I let it be a story about the cold and about bad luck. And I've worn his initials on my back for 40 years, so I'd never let myself forget what I did. And I built half of what I built out of trying to make up for a thing you can't make up for. He set the vest down, very gently, like it might break. And then 2 weeks ago I'm lying in the gravel bleeding out, and here comes a kid who's got every reason in the world to keep driving. A kid who needs that morning more than I ever needed wherever I was going. And he stops. He does the exact thing I didn't do. He looked up at Deacon, and his eyes were wet and steady at the same time. You asked me why this one's different, Ray said. That's why. That boy did the thing I've spent my whole life wishing I'd done. And I am not going to send him a card, Deacon. I'm not going to send him a card and call it square. He wiped his face with the flat of his hand, businesslike, a man deciding something. Get everybody. Get the chapters. This Saturday, we're going to go find that kid, and we're going to do this right. Saturday came in clear and bright and ordinary. Eli was out on the porch that morning, finally doing the thing he'd been meaning to do for a year, fixing the broken step. Colleen was crouched beside him holding the board steady while he worked a screw in, and Mia was on the grass nearby, half helping and half getting in the way, And there was nothing about the morning that felt like anything at all. Just a family and a wobbly step and a bright cold Saturday. The kind of small, ordinary chore that means the week's other fires are, for once, out. Then Eli's hammer paused. There was a sound. Far off, low, at the edge of hearing. A single engine, and then, no, more than one. He sat back on his heels and looked up toward the end of the street. Colleen looked up too. The sound was growing, rolling in from somewhere out past the neighborhood, a low thunder that you felt in the boards under your knees before you'd fully placed it. 2 engines, then a half dozen. Then it kept climbing until it stopped being a number you could count and became a single thing, a wall of sound coming closer, and the windows in the little leaning house began, faintly, to buzz. They came around the corner at the end of the street. Motorcycles, not 2 or 3. Dozens, and behind those dozens, more, a river of them filling the whole width of the road, and still coming, headlights on in the daylight, filling the block from curb to curb until it seemed the entire street was made of them. Neighbors came out onto their lawns up and down the block, drawn by the sound, standing with their hands shading their eyes. Mia scrambled up off the grass. Colleen was on her feet, and her hand found Mia's shoulder and pulled her in close. And there was real fear in her face, because 100 motorcycles turning onto your quiet street is not, in the first moment, obviously a good thing. It is just enormous and loud and unexplained, and every instinct a mother has says gather your children. Eli stood up slow, the hammer still in his hand, and without deciding to, he stepped in front of his mother and his sister. He didn't understand it any better than they did, but whatever was coming, he put himself between it and them first and figure it out after. That was just where his body went. The riders filled the street and, one by one, cut their engines. And the silence that dropped after all that thunder was its own kind of enormous. 100 men and a few women sat their bikes in front of a small leaning house, quiet now, and nobody moved, and Eli stood on his half-fixed porch with his heart going and no idea in the world what he was looking at. Then, from somewhere in the middle of all of them, one man swung a leg off his bike and started forward. He came slowly, and there was a cane, and he leaned on it as he crossed the patchy lawn, a big, gray-bearded man, careful on one leg. He stopped a few feet from the porch and looked up at Eli, and Eli looked back at him and did not know him. This upright, healthy, weathered man in the sunlight had nothing in common with the memory Eli carried of a person crumpled in the gravel going pale. "You don't recognize me," the man said. "I don't blame you. I looked a lot worse the last time." He let that sit a second. "You told me a job could wait. And it landed." All of it landed at once, and Eli's mouth opened and nothing came out, and the hammer slipped out of his hand and thudded onto the porch boards. Ray came the last few steps and put his free arm around the boy and held on, and Eli, after a frozen instant, held on back, and behind them the whole street of riders stood in silence and watched 2 people who barely knew each other hold on to each other like family. Colleen had both hands over her mouth. Mia was staring, wide-eyed, peeking half around her mother. Up and down the block the neighbors stood witnessing something they didn't understand and could tell they shouldn't interrupt. When Ray finally let go, he held Eli at arm's length and looked at him a moment, and then he said, "You want to know why 100 people showed up at your house on a Saturday? It wasn't a question. It's because of what you did. That's it. That's the whole reason. But I didn't ride out here just to say thank you. A thank you I could have mailed." He reached inside his vest and drew something out and held it up between them. A plain manila folder, a little worn at the corners now, but clean. Someone had cleaned it. Eli stared at it. It was his. The one he'd squared on the passenger seat that morning a lifetime ago. The one that had slid out into the gravel while a paramedic was scooping up the last of a dying man's belongings. "You left this behind," Ray said. "That's actually how we found you. Your company folder, sitting right there in the dirt." A rough smile moved in his beard. "Figured you'd want it back. For the real one." The real one. "I own a freight company," Ray said. "Piece of one anyway. Me and a few of these knuckleheads out here. We run a regional outfit, trucks and yards, and the whole business. You didn't know that. No reason you would. I don't ride around advertising it." He tapped the folder against Eli's chest, gentle. "I told my operations manager about a kid who lost a job for stopping to save somebody's life on the side of the road. Her name's Gloria Ruiz. She runs a tight house, and she doesn't hand out anything to anybody, and I want to be real clear with you about that. This is not me handing you a job. I wouldn't insult you like that, and Gloria wouldn't stand for it if I tried. This is an interview. A real one. You show up early, I'm guessing, from what I hear about you, and you sit down across from Gloria, and you earn it same as anybody. That's all I'm giving you. A door that's open. Whether you walk through it is on you. Eli's throat was working. He looked down at the folder in his hands, the one he'd carried into the worst morning of his life, back now, cleaned by strangers, held out to him by a man he'd left for dead on a road. I don't know what to say, he managed. Say you'll come Monday, Ray said. And then, quieter, half to himself, in a voice Eli almost didn't catch, somebody did the opposite for me once. Long time ago. Took me 40 years to find a way to fix it. Eli didn't understand it then. He would, later. For now, Ray just squeezed his shoulder and said, louder, 8 o'clock. Don't be late. And the corner of his mouth went up, and behind them 100 engines came back to life all at once, and the street filled again with that enormous rolling thunder, and the Iron Saints turned their bikes around and rode back out the way they'd come, leaving a family standing on a half-fixed porch trying to understand what had just happened to them. Colleen came and stood beside her son and looked at the folder in his hands, and then at the last of the taillights disappearing around the corner, and she didn't say anything at all for a long moment. Then she put her arm around him. I don't understand, she said softly. Me neither, Ma, Eli said. I think that's the guy. From the accident. The one I never told you about. She turned and looked at him, and a whole conversation happened in her face without a word in it. The ruined shirt she'd found in the trash and never asked about. The rust-colored lines in his knuckles she'd chosen not to question. All of it, understood at last. You never said, she whispered. Didn't seem like something to say. She looked at him a long time. This boy she'd warned about the price of being the only one who stops. And she didn't have the words for what was in her chest, so she just pulled him in and held him on the porch in the sunlight. And Mia wrapped her arms around both of them, and the three of them stood there in the quiet the bikes had left behind. Monday morning, Eli showed up at the freight yard at 20 of 8, 20 minutes early, in a borrowed shirt because he hadn't replaced the white one and there'd been no time, and he sat down across a desk from Gloria Ruiz, who did not smile and did not soften and made it clear from the first minute exactly where things stood. I know why you're here, she said. Ray told me the story, and I want to say this so there's no confusion between us. That story got you a chair in this room. It does not get you one thing past that. I have run this operation for a long time, and I don't put people on my floor because somebody feels good about them. So you can put the whole hero business out of your head right now, because I don't care about it. I care whether you show up, whether you work, and whether I can count on you. Can I? Yes, ma'am, Eli said. We'll see, she said, and she meant it, and Eli liked her immediately. He got the job, not because of the story. The story was a chair in a room, exactly like she'd said. He got it the way he'd told Mia you get everything, 90% of it, which is by showing up when you said you would. He showed up early every single day. He was the first one on the floor most mornings, standing at the gate in the gray light with a coffee going cold in his hand, and the men who'd been there 20 years noticed, the way men who've been somewhere 20 years always notice the new kid who acts like he's grateful to be there. Some of them tested him a little, gave him the ugly jobs, the ones nobody wanted, and Eli did them without complaint and did them right, and after a couple of weeks the testing stopped, and something else took its place. They started saving him a seat at lunch. They started teaching him things they didn't have to teach him. He worked the floor at first, loading and checking and hauling, the same kind of labor he'd been doing for scraps, except now it was steady. Now it came with a schedule you could build a life around. Now it came with that word that had sounded like background noise to everybody, but the people who'd never had it. Insurance. He learned the operation from the concrete up. He learned it fast, because he paid attention, because he was the kind of person who noticed things, and Gloria noticed that he noticed, though she'd have died before she said so. Over the months he moved up. They put him on the systems that tracked the freight, taught him the routes and the manifests and the 1,000 moving pieces of getting a thing from one place to another on time, and it turned out Eli had a head for it. The same instinct that made him read the mail before his mother could, the same instinct to see the whole board and get ahead of the trouble before it arrived. They made him a logistics coordinator. He brought home a paycheck that would have been unimaginable a year before, and the first real thing it bought wasn't anything you could hold. It bought his mother a night's sleep. Colleen dropped one of her 2 jobs. She kept the nursing home, because she loved the old people there and they loved her, but she let the second job go, and for the first time in years, she slept a full night through and woke in daylight without an alarm dragging her out of it. Eli came home one afternoon and found her asleep on the couch in a square of sun, an open book fallen on her chest, and he stood in the doorway a long moment and did not wake her. He just watched her breathe, easy, for once, and something in him that had been clenched tight his whole life eased open a fraction. He and Ray grew close over those months, closer than the accident alone would explain. Ray took him around the business, showed him things, introduced him to people with a hand on his shoulder and a note of something almost paternal in his voice. And somewhere in there, in the cab of a truck one afternoon or leaning on a loading dock at dusk, Ray finally told him the rest of it. Told him about a cold night 40 years gone, and a man off the side of a road waving at whoever came over the rise, and a young Ray who told himself somebody else would stop. Told him the initials on the back of every vest were a man named Sam Doyle, and told him what Ray had carried every day since, and told him, plainly, that the morning Eli chose him over a warehouse job was the morning a debt Ray had thought could never be paid finally got answered. "You didn't just stop for me," Ray said. "You reached back 40 years and stopped for Sam too. You'll never know what that did. But I figured you ought to know you did it." Eli sat with that a long time. He understood, finally, the weight that had been in the man's voice out on the road that first morning. "You shouldn't have stopped, kid." It hadn't been about the job at all. And for a while, that was the whole shape of it. The kind of ending people hope for and rarely get. The kid who did the right thing, and the right thing that came back to him at last, and a family that could breathe. If the story had ended there, it would have been a good one. But it hadn't quite gotten around to asking Eli its real question yet. The real question came on an ordinary afternoon, months into the new life, outside the freight yard where Eli worked. There was a sound out on the road, the awful specific sound of metal meeting something it shouldn't, and then shouting, and people running to the fence and the gate to look. A car had come together with another vehicle out on the road that ran past the yard, and there was a person down in the street, and around that person a crowd was forming, the way crowds form, a ring of people with their phones half up and their feet not moving, everybody waiting for somebody else to be the one. And Eli, who now had everything, who had a career and a paycheck and a mother sleeping through the night, who had every reason in the world a careful person could name to hang back, to let the professionals handle it, to protect the good thing he'd finally built. Eli was already moving. He was through the gate before he'd thought about it. He was across the road and down on his knees beside a stranger with his hands already working, calling out for somebody to phone it in, telling the person on the ground the same low, steady thing he'd told a gray-bearded man in the gravel a year before. "Stay with me. Stay with me. Help's coming. You just stay with me." There was no hesitation in him this time. Not a flicker of it. The thing that had crept into him after the warehouse, that voice that had once said you stopped last time and look what it got you. It was simply gone, burned all the way out. He didn't have to choose between being a good person and being an okay one anymore. He got to be both. He knelt in the road and did the only thing he'd ever really known how to do. And this time, a year wiser and a life more secure, he didn't count the cost, because he finally understood there wasn't one worth counting. And here is the small thing. The thing that tells you the whole story is true even though the whole story is only a story. This time, he wasn't alone. One of the bystanders, a man who'd been standing frozen in the ring with everybody else, saw Eli break out of the crowd and drop down beside the stranger, and something in the sight of it broke the man loose too. He came out of the crowd and knelt down on the other side and asked what he could do. And Eli told him, and the two of them worked together over a stranger in the road until the ambulance came. One person stops, and it gives somebody else permission to stop, and that is how it spreads. That is how it has always spread. Eli Carter is still out there, somewhere on an ordinary road, being an ordinary person who happens to stop. His mother sleeps through the night now. His sister is growing up in a house that no longer leans quite so hard into the wind, with a porch step that got fixed on a bright Saturday morning that turned out to be about a great deal more than a porch step. Ray Mercer rides again, cane strapped to the frame, lighter than he's been in 40 years, and at the Iron Saints clubhouse there is still an empty chair kept for a man named Sam Doyle. But the room around it sits a little easier now, the way a room does when a debt inside it has finally been answered. Somewhere along the way, without anyone sitting him down to teach it, Eli learned the thing his mother had tried to warn him about and the thing she couldn't promise him, both at once. She'd told him there was a price for being the only one who stops, and she was right, and he paid it. He paid it in a white shirt and a warehouse job and the worst morning of his life. But what she couldn't promise, because she'd never seen the world do it, was that the price could be worth paying. That doing the right thing can cost you something real before it ever gives anything back, and that the morning that looks like it ended your future can turn out to be the exact place your future begins. He stopped for a stranger, and he lost a job. And in losing it, without ever meaning to, without asking for a thing, he found a whole life. And reached back across 40 years to a cold road he'd never ridden, and helped pay a debt no one thought could ever be paid.